And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this week. Mikaela Boley is the Principal Agent Associate for Home Horticulture in Talbot County. So, Mikaela, your
Thank you
slides
so
are being
much.
shared, and you're looking good.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. And don't worry, I mentioned not only native plants during the talk today, but also native grasses. So you're not out of the woods yet, Emily.
I would not expect anything less from any talk of yours.
Awesome. No, thank you for having me. And it's been really fun to look through the chat and see where everybody is hailing from. So even though the title of the talk is Climate Wise Maryland, the information really is applicable to all parts of the nation. We're just going to be talking a little bit about climate, how that's been changing, how it affects our landscapes, and then what are some of the strategies or things that we can start to think about in response to that. Because, of course, our landscapes are living, dynamic things, as we're all starting to learn. All right, and as we get going, I know you've probably seen this message before, but I really think it's important to stress that university programs and activities and facilities are available to all without regard to race, color, sex, gender identity, expression, and any other kind of category. The bottom line is we do not discriminate, and this "And Justice for All" poster is a really good reminder of any information you might need to file a discrimination with USDA. But we don't think that that will happen today because we are going to face some really fun, I say fun topics, but some really interesting conversations today. And the first thing I like to ask is what kind of challenges are you facing today? What are you noticing maybe in your landscape that's changed? Especially if you've been in a place for a very long time, or maybe it's stuff that you're seeing in the news. Feel free to drop some of those comments in the chat box, because of course we're seeing a lot of things that didn't occur previously. We're seeing more flood events, more extreme flooding events, more extreme droughts. I see somebody saying rising temperatures. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And just to help you all around more erratic weather, yes, you're all way ahead of me. You're all listing some of the things that I'm going to be talking about, which is increasing in wetter areas or flooding when it does happen. We're seeing a lot of trees, particularly forests, in rapid decline for a number of different reasons. Increasing of pest pressure. This is kind of an interesting one because it's not just weeds or invasive plants. We're also talking about mammals and insects, things that may have been introduced to an area, and because of the climate, maybe just thriving because of it. And especially areas in the coastal plain, like on the eastern shore, or anybody who's in a coastal situation, higher salinity and saltwater intrusion. That's a very real thing that we're facing, especially with a kind of flat elevation. And then the increase in heat and drought stress, which is in turn stressing out our plants a lot more, stressing us out a lot more, myself in particular. I don't like the summer. I don't like the heat. And then things that are kind of the result of also human activities, soil degradation, or even erosion. And what we're seeing is a large decrease in beneficial insect or bird activity as well. And even though that might not be an instantaneous result of changes, it's something that we're noticing in the long term. We're seeing a lot of disturbance in our ecological regimes. So I know this is a really heavy topic to tackle today and to start out with, but what we're going to cover is we're going to talk about watering needs as it relates to landscapes and what we can do within our own power, climatic influences and trends, some of the changes that we can anticipate. And then we're going to talk about some other management strategies, and that involves a lot of like landscape design or thinking about choosing the plants that we use in our landscapes differently, which is where the native plants will come in, I promise you. All right, so what I like to do is go back to basics. And, I say back to basics, avoiding fertilizing unless you have a soil test result that says you may be deficient in certain things. So, and actually, I'm sorry, it's not especially now, but we just want to avoid fertilizing, and over fertilizing is part of routine land care practices, because that's something that we'll see commonly in the spring is, of course, the application of fertilizers to green up our lawns. But really, if we're just doing this without an understanding of soil testing and what is already existing in our soils or what deficiencies are there, it doesn't make for a very it doesn't make for good practices. The other thing I'd like to say is allowing turf to go dormant. This is something that's part of a smart watering practice. As we go into summer and we go through those periods of drought and heat, what a lot of our tall fescues do in this climate is they want to go dormant in order to protect themselves and not be as stressed out. I know that doesn't make sense, but it's kind of their way of mitigating the heat and the drought. And if we continue to water things through the summer too consistently, like we're watering every day or using irrigation every day, it actually stresses the grass out more. I know that's kind of counterintuitive, but these are just some things to be thinking about as we're going into summer here. The other thing I really like to advocate for is the use of soaker hoses or somehow slow release of water for garden beds. This creates a much more strong root system, especially in our native perennials and shrubs. But because that water soaks into the soil more slowly, it's able to reach deeper into the soil and thus, develop a better root system that's going to be deeper in the soil as well. Because if we have too shallow of a root system that's near the top of the soil, they dry out much more quickly. And I also really advocate for the use of cisterns or rain barrels where you're actually using them as catchments for when we do have heavy rainfall, because we do get adequate rain here in Maryland. I think our average is 45 inches a year, which is more than Seattle, Washington. I just want to point that out. So we're kind of in this temperate climate, but it also is a little bit of a rainforest, a temperate rainforest. And I also highly recommend using a rain gauge, because this will help you determine what your water needs are and if they aren't being fulfilled naturally. So a rain system will, if a rainstorm or event comes through and you don't know how much rain you've gotten and you just go and irrigate as normal, you may be actually overwatering your landscapes. And I just like to point this picture out. This is from my yard, by the way. It was during a rainstorm event. Oh gosh, I think it was like 2024, where we got 5 inches of rain in one sitting. And I actually had dumped this rain gauge out like before the rain had finished. So technically we got more than 5 inches of rain. Am I going to be watering or irrigating that week? Absolutely not. We got 5 inches of rain. Most plants need about an inch of rain or an inch of water per week. So that's just a really good illustration of being kind of in tune with our landscapes and knowing what Mother Nature is supplying, and then supplementing if we really need to. Whoops. All right. So this is just an example of some of our water use in the United States. Over 9 billion gallons is dedicated towards garden and lawn. And a third of this water is for residential water use. So the other is probably commercial or, higher grade landscapes. But 50% of water is lost to wind, evaporation, or even overwatering and runoff. So that's a pretty significant number. So to say that, 4.5 billions of gallons is being lost to these different services means that we maybe aren't watering as smartly as we should be. And of course, the increased use and the highest use is during the summer months, and losses, because of course, with higher temperatures, more sun, we're seeing more transpiration, more evaporation. So I think those numbers are pretty impactful and really makes you think about how we can use our water a little bit more smartly, and what we can do to mitigate that water loss as well. So again, what does this mean for homeowners or people who are residents? Plants require about 1 to 2 inches of rainfall of water per week. So that could come from natural systems, like I said, rainfall, or it could be irrigation. I would wager that many of us are probably going over that amount, especially if you have irrigation systems in place. And if those irrigation systems are not in tuned to the natural rainfall, some of them, are on a timer and they don't sense when there's been natural rainfall, and so they'll come on immediately after we've already had rainstorm, and that's where we get a lot of root rot issues. Is this chronic overwatering? And like I said, this is why we want to develop strong root systems, roots that are growing deep into the soil, because they're going to be chasing the moisture and the nutrients in the soil. So if the moisture doesn't go deep enough in the soil, the roots won't go deep enough in the soil as well. So what I say about irrigation is that we should not be irrigating every day. Is it accounting for natural rainfall? Have we taken that into consideration? Are irrigation heads pointed in the right direction? Are you watering the sidewalk by accident? That happens a lot, by the way. That's probably where a lot of moisture loss goes into as well. And I really encourage people into thinking about drip versus overhead irrigation, because higher transpiration rates, transpiration is the loss of water off of leaf surface. And evaporation, the same thing, it's the loss of moisture. So when you do more overhead watering, that's where we tend to see more of the moisture loss. But you also will tend to see higher disease incidences. Because of course in the summer, it's humid here in Maryland, in the mid-Atlantic area. And if you water late enough in the day, that moisture will sit on the leaf surface, and it will, it'll actually culminate and create an environment for disease. So what I like to encourage people to do is to water as close to the base of the plant as possible. And that's why drip irrigation is a great option. But even if you're watering by hand, pointing the hose or your sprinkler at the base of the plant versus overhead, you'll see a lot more conservation of water that way. And I think this is a great graphic to kind of demonstrate how we should be watering. And what I also like to say is, if you don't know, if you are using a sprinkler system and you don't know how much water is being delivered, you can do a really easy test. You can take a clear container, such as the one in the upper left corner, and you can put your watering system on and leave the container out where it's receiving water as though it were a plant, right? And then you time it for maybe a half hour, 30 minutes. And then you go out and you measure how much water was delivered in that half hour. And that should give you a really good idea of how long your system should be on in order to deliver maybe a half inch or the inch of rain that would be needed in the landscape. The graphic on the right, I think, is a really good illustration of why we want to avoid that frequent light watering, where you're only getting the top inch or two of the soil watered, because those root systems will only grow right at that root surface, and they'll dry out very quickly. They'll be very susceptible to drought. But if we do infrequent and heavy waterings, where you're actually soaking a good part of the soil horizon, then you start to see roots that will develop deeper into the soil. And I see somebody asked in the chat box, and I just happened to see it, is it better to water plants in the early morning or midday? I would say early morning. If you water plants in the midday, what happens is it can actually burn the leaf surface, especially if it's a hot summer day. And that's where you're going to get the most transpiration as well. You're going to get the most evaporation, is that because of the heat. And you don't want to do that to your plants. So the morning is always a preferable time for watering plants. Okay. And this is kind of a really cool system to consider. I actually have a homemade ala at home. And it's these clay watering pots. And this is a really ancient practice. And I can't remember where it originated from. I want to say South America. Or no, I'm sorry, Mexico. I think it's Mexico. But this is a very ancient method of watering or irrigation, where you're actually burying these pots, as you can see in the graphic on the right. You're burying the pots so that the top of them is open. And and they can be closed. They actually should be closed sometimes so that things don't fall in there. But you can open them up, and then you water into that container, and the water sits in these clay pots, which are a permeable material, right? So they're a porous material. The water loss goes out into the soil around it, thus watering the plants in a more deep manner than you would be able to do if you were to just water topside. So this is kind of a nice steady delivery of moisture underground. And again, encouraging those root systems to grow deeply into the soil. The catch, though, and that's unfortunate for me because I have clay soils, is that this is a much better method for sandier or coarse soils because they permeate a little bit better, or they permeate a little bit better into the soil. With clay, because the clay particles are so tiny in clay soils, it's harder for that water to move sideways. So this is good news for people with sandy or coarse soils. Even loamy soils will probably be fine with these. But they also work really well in like raised beds. That's actually where I see them used, is in raised garden beds, vegetable beds, and they'll be buried about every 2 to 3 feet, depending on how big your clay pot is. And they'll be buried, and then they just come through and they water them. And you might have to check them every once in a while to see how quickly the water is disappearing. But that's a really nice option, especially as an alternative to overhead watering. And this is, I thought, a really great graphic. This is the kind of Aya pot I have at home. It's just made out of commercial terracotta pots that I bought at whatever store. You can actually glue them together and create your own. But the idea is that those pots do have holes in the top and the bottom. And so you want to plug one of those holes permanently so that the water loss doesn't go straight through the bottom, because that's going to be the side that gets buried. But the top hole, you can either cork or leave open, and that is where you would refill the pot with water once you've buried it and get it established. But you do need the top of these pots to sit above the soil surface, just so that you can access them. Don't bury the top, because otherwise you'll never find them. And then they'll probably get clogged up with soil as well. So I thought that was a really interesting alternative to watering. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit more about the climatic influences and trends that we're seeing. Again, this is kind of a reiteration of what we talked about at the beginning, so I won't belabor this point, but what we're going to probably see more of is hotter temperature averages over the land and sea, longer drought periods when they do occur, and then more extreme weather events when they occur. There will be longer periods in between them, but when they happen, they're going to be intense. Higher velocity of rainstorm events, and even earlier springs and later falls. And what I'm going to show in the next graphic is how our growing zones have changed. We actually had an updated map in 2023, and over 50% of the United States shifted a half a zone hotter than we used to be. And then, of course, the pest pressures we talked about, and then saltwater intrusion and sea level rise, which will impact a lot of us on the coastal plain, at least. So I believe this is the 2023 map. Let me look just quickly. Actually, no, this might be an older map. It's hard to tell. It's far away, but this is a map you can easily find. This is put out by USDA. And if you Google USDA growing zone map, what you can do is you'll find the website and you plug in your zip code, and it zooms into what your region looks like, and you can have a much more close-up picture of what your growing zone looks like. And what's interesting is that because we're getting better at taking data and having all of the data available to us, our growing zones are becoming more detailed. So I'll use the Eastern Shore as an example. Route 50, to the left of Route 50 or to the west of Route 50, a lot of the growing zones are 8A, but everything to the east is 7B or 7A. And that's just because we're seeing a lot of influences from the Chesapeake Bay, a lot of coastal shoreline And that difference wouldn't have been noticed the last time that they released this map. Again, I see somebody's asking, what is it? It's the USDA growing zone map. And you should be able to look up your zip code. And this is just kind of interesting because this was an analysis done to see how growing zones have changed or are projected to change. And now it's not too far away. 2030, 2040 is not too far away for us. And as we're seeing, everything's getting a little bit warmer. We're seeing a shift of growing zones from the south. So a lot of things that used to be colder are migrating north. And that might not seem like a huge issue, but it does impact our plants tremendously, especially for native plants whose growing ranges are now migrating north. I like to use maples, sugar maples as a good example. I love maple syrup, but what that means for me is that Maryland in the projected future may not be able to support a climate that supports sugar maple growth. So it may be that maple syrup in the far future will not be able to be produced in Maryland anymore. So that's just one of the many reasons that we're concerned about it. But just to remind everybody, so plant hardiness zone is determined based on your average annual extreme minimum temperature. So it takes an average of all these extreme minimum temperatures over a 30-year period. So this is why we get updates on this map and why I think they release it every 12 to 15 years. They'll release a new one because, of course, the averages are changing over time. So keep that in mind. It's not the lowest temperature that has ever occurred in a region. It's something that has taken way over time. But as I also like to point out, we also have a plant heat zone map. And this is the opposite, right? It's the number of days that occur over a certain temperature. And you'll notice in the bottom right corner, average number of days per year above 86 degrees. That number is significant because many plants start to exhibit stress at 86 degrees, physiological decline. It's funny because me too. As soon as it hits 86 degrees, I'm out. I don't want to be outside anymore. But plants are the same way. So this is why this information is kind of helpful to know because there are many plants that would not be tolerable to heat, especially that much heat over the course of time. And I think here's a map of Maryland. And it looks a little bit similar, looks very similar to the growing zone map that we just talked about. But this one, again, is calculating the number of days that occur over 86 degrees over a certain amount of time. So I think that's equally as important to keep in mind, especially as we enter this higher average temperature climate that we're experiencing. But because there's a lot of plants that will not tolerate this heat. And I thought this was an interesting study that I came across, and it demonstrates different parts of the United States and how our heavy precipitation events will be impacted. And of course, we're in the Northeast, and we're kind of lumped into the Northeast in this study. But 71% increase in the amount of precipitation falling in a heavy rain event, which is an incredible. We already see a lot of moisture, right? 45 inches of rain per year. An estimated 71% increase is very impactful in this particular region. And in fact, you'll see, I think Hawaii is the only one that's experiencing a deficit or a decrease in the amount of precipitation. But again, these are just estimates. These are just projected estimations of what we're going to be seeing as our climate changes. So I thought that was really, really interesting. All right, now I'm really going to get a little techie on you here, but it's just because I think these resources are really interesting and could be very helpful for many of us. So there's something called a growing degree day, and that is calculated based on temperatures that are over 50 degrees, and they accumulate using a special formula. So we use it to estimate what kind of pests we might be seeing and when they might be arriving. And I even have a really good resource that explains how you would use what's called a pest predictive calendar. And it's just so that we can start to estimate not only when pests and diseases might be an issue, but when things start to bloom as well. And you don't need to exactly know how to calculate the numbers, but just understand that those numbers are used so that professionals like Emily, Haley, and I can kind of predict like when spotted lantern will be about to emerge. In fact, we're coming up close at the end of April is going to be when we're start to see egg hatch. But that's what we use in order to help predict what kind of phenology, which is, when things start to bloom and progress, but also when these pests might be an issue and when we might start seeing questions from the public. But there's also this drought monitor map, which I think is really helpful. So that's the map on the bottom. And I took this picture yesterday, 2 days ago. So despite the rain that we got on Easter Sunday, most of Maryland is still in a moderate drought. I know that's really hard to believe. It's hard for me to believe when my yard feels so soggy. But we did not get as much moisture this winter as we normally do. In fact, January and February were quite dry. And so that impacts things down the line, right? As we come into spring, it's good to note that we're in currently a moderate drought. A lot of us are anyways. And to know what your watering needs might be or what new plants might be susceptible to drought coming into the summer. Because, of course, summer is when we typically see less rainfall. So this is just good to keep on your radar and to think about as we come into spring, again, especially if you have new plants or you're planting trees or shrubs. Those are things that have high needs when we come to the first year. Excuse me, and making sure that they're properly watered. So just like I said, overwatering can be too much of a problem. Of course, drought is also a problem. It's really hard to figure out the exact perfect amount of water that plants need. They can't talk to us. They can't tell us. Oh, well, good. I included a slide about spotted lanternfly. So this is going back to those growing degree days I talked about. And you can actually calculate them online and find them. I use the Climate Smart Farming tool. I think Cornell is the one that produced it, and they have a nice chart to show you historically what the growing degree days are and what the projected growing degree days will be. And what did I take this? Saturday. I took, so this is the number of growing degree days we've had so far this year is 178. And if I cross-reference it to when the spotted lanternfly is predicted to emerge from their eggs, 270. So if I look down the line, if I look at the chart online, I can find that they're probably going to start emerging and hatching the 25th through the 30th of April. So don't be surprised if at the end of this month you start to see that nymphal stage of the spotted lanternfly. It's just an example of how we use growing degree days to kind of predict what pests we're going to see. And, I'm sorry. And this is for the location of Easton, Maryland. It's going to be different depending on your location because, of course, the temperature varies across the state. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about what we can do landscape management-wise. We're going to look at some strategies to mitigate, or to help get ahead of some of these issues that we're starting to see. And the picture that I have in this particular slide, this is a living shoreline in Talbot County. And, ideally we would have a living shoreline with no riprap in the front, but because of wave action and just tidal influences, sometimes that's not always an option. So this particular property used a riprap in the front, but behind it is a very healthy living shoreline. So this is a nice combination of techniques to mitigate shoreline erosion, which is what was happening prior to this being built. So thinking about designing for climate pressures, stormwater catchments, even rain barrels we talked about before, that is a stormwater management technique. You're taking water that would normally have to fall on the ground or maybe cause erosion depending on where the downspout is, and you're actually holding it in place with the intention of using it later, and in fact may reduce your watering strategies because you can use that water to water your plants when it isn't raining. And really, you would calculate the size of your rain barrel depending on how much roof space that you have. But even if you can just do what we call slow the flow, this is slowing down the flow of water or runoff off of the surface, and that could be paved surfaces, but it also could be across just bare soil or even turf grass, because turf grass has some permeability when it comes to stormwater, but grass roots are not very deep. And they're not very large, so they don't absorb as much water as maybe some of their native plant counterparts could do. And making sure that you're properly selecting your plants. Do a little bit of research and evaluating of the landscape to make sure that you're putting in plants that like living in that particular area. I like to pick on turf because turf grass does not like to grow in very wet spots. And there's inevitably spots in my landscape that collect water and just sits there because I have a heavy clay soil. So those are good places to put other plants that like having wet feet, that like living in wet soil, because the turf grass doesn't, and it's never going to thrive if it's in a system it doesn't like to grow in. Using natural rainfall, as I said before, planting a variety of plants as well. Again, turf grass, I love to pick on it, because turf grass is all just the same thing, right? It's just a monoculture of the same type of grass. Sometimes weeds, if you're like me and you don't treat your weeds. But planting a variety of native plants, things that have different shapes and sizes, or that provide for wildlife and biodiversity, those are much more preferable than having a system that is just a monoculture of one thing. And I would also argue that we always forget about our soil. The soil is where everything starts, right? If you don't have healthy soil, or you can't build a healthy soil, the plants might not be healthy either. So thinking about that long term, because we're finding landscapes that have used cover crops or even just use native plant debris where you have a lot of organic matter, that tends to have a much healthier soil system. Everybody loves to take away their leaves at the end of fall because they're worried about it killing their grass. But truth is, a lot of those leaves provide organic matter when they break down, and they do break down over the winter. Oak leaves might be the exception to the rule, but like maple leaves are really fragile. And so I never worry about removing those from the landscape because they just break down, and then they create more organic matter that creates a healthier soil in turn. So it is all interwoven, it's all connected. And this is more of a design strategy, thinking about these two different pictures. Thinking about landscapes that plant large trees under utility lines. Long term, that usually means that those trees either have to get topped or pruned in some way. So you're looking at long-term management. And somebody is always going to have to come back, and those trees will suffer too because you have to prune them pretty harshly. And then likewise, using large evergreens that are too close to the house, that may be on a south-facing part of the house, so you're actually blocking winter sunlight that could passively warm your home. So if we look at the opposite of that on the right, using shorter trees or trees that at maturity aren't going to reach those power lines is a great option, because then you never have to come back and prune them. And then using evergreens as more of a north break. So that's what we call a wind break. When you're using evergreen plants to block the wind, because in the winter, the coldest winds will come from the northeast. And so by using those evergreen plants on the north side of the property, you can actually break some of that cold winter air and protect your property as well. And I usually like to recommend using deciduous trees on the south-facing part of houses, because what happens is they shade them in the summer when it's hot, so it provides a cooling technique. But then in the winter, because all the leaves are gone, it passively warms your house because the sun can come through and get through your windows as well. So that's just an example of some of the design strategies that we use in landscapes to deal with our climates. I also like to encourage people to avoid cool season turfgrass types. And those are usually plants that thrive when it's in cooler weather, but then in the summer, they tend to go dormant. Like I said, that tall fescue is about the only one I can think of that is pretty tolerant to the mid-Atlantic area. But really, I think you should just think about using turfgrass and plant types that are appropriate for your region, particularly native plants, because they tend to be very well adapted to the soil types, the other plant communities, and of course, the temperatures here. And I like to even think about plants that have a broad native range. So things that are also native here that might be native in North Carolina as well. We have a lot of plants that are adapted well to the coastal region because it is so temperate. I would not select native plants where we're at like the southern end of their native growing range. And sugar maples are a good example of that. So really in the Piedmont and the mountain region is about where sugar maples grow. I would not plant one on the coastal plain of Maryland because it really just doesn't like our climate here. It's a little too hot, a little too stressful for them. Also think about slope location because a south-facing slope will tend to be a location that's drier and hotter. But maybe that's a really good candidate for using something like native grasses because they stabilize slope very well. They have really substantial root systems and they can handle the heat and the climate there. But likewise, on a north-facing slope, it's going to be a little more moist because it doesn't see as much sunlight. And it's going to be in shade a lot more. So you wouldn't want to select something that would need full sun if you were going to be planting a north side of a slope. And I really do like to encourage the planting of trees and shrubs because they tend to be long-term plants that will be in the landscape for a really long time, but also the use of native warm season grasses. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. I have a whole slide dedicated to it. This is kind of an example of using slope, although this is in response to like a riparian zone would be like if you had a stream, a freshwater stream or system, even a pond. And talking about the different growing zones that even occur on those banks to streams and rivers and lakes. So they have different plant types for those different growing zones. And you tend to see more of the deciduous trees and the evergreens in the upland zone versus if you were planting on the bank of a stream system, you would want more of the shrubs and the herbaceous perennial types. Because they're better at soaking up water more quickly. With the exception, there's always exceptions to the rule. There's a lot of trees that do like to have wet feet as well. All right, so here's going to be my pitch for native grasses. I always have to make one. So warm season native grasses, and we have a lot of them in Maryland, but across the United States, they're a very significant group. They are really good at what we call carbon sequestration. So it means they take carbon out of the atmosphere or in the soil and they hold on to them. And an intact grassland can sequester 2 to 5 tons of carbon per year per acre. That's just 1 acre. Native grasses are really good at doing that. And trees are really good at doing that as well. They're really good at carbon sequestration. The other thing I like to argue is that native grasses are what we call a C4 plant. All that really means is that they process heat and carbon from the air really efficiently. And they require less water in order to function. And so they are a really good choice for areas where heat and drought are a concern. But these plants only represent about 5% of Earth's biomass. But grasses account for 20 to 30% of carbon sequestration, carbon dioxide fixation. So those are some really significant numbers. Again, warm season grasses, these are the C4 plants. They're really good at photosynthesizing and very productive in hot and dry climates. And then, of course, my last argument I'll make is that they have really deep root systems. If we were to dig these plants out of the ground, they would go like 6 to 8 feet, depending on the species. as opposed to turf grass, which only has like 4 to 5 inches of root systems. So native grasses are, once they get established, they're very significant plants. That means they make excellent above ground vegetated buffers. So they soak up water during rain events, especially if you're dealing with runoff or areas where water is even just ponding. They make for really good buffer systems. And they're also a part of a drought resistant landscape. They make a really good addition because a lot of the Great Plains out west are primarily made up of native grasses. And that's for a reason. It's because they only see maybe less than 10 inches of rainfall per year. So grasses are a really good alternative for people who are battling drought or even areas where you're trying to mitigate water runoff. And then just to think about trees, because trees are really fascinating parts of our landscape, not just for aesthetic reasons, but for functionality. Urban trees and forests intercept, I think, up to 66% of rainfall runoff, which means when that rain hits a tree canopy, it has to fall through all those different leaves. And so it really slows down the velocity of the rain before it can even get to the ground, which is where we want to prevent erosion from occurring. So they do a really good job of intercepting that rain, making sure it's not such high velocity. And I want to say, oh gosh, I forget what the infiltration rate is too, but hold on just a second. I'll figure it out. But trees are really good at infiltrating water once they do get to that soil. So again, if we're having areas where we're seeing a lot of rainfall and a lot of moisture and we don't know what to do with them, trees not only mitigate those conditions very well, but they also provide shade, right? We're talking about cooling, talking about heat island effects, especially in more urban areas. Trees are a very natural solution to some of these problems and an often forgotten one. Again, they're just really good at mitigating some of these issues that we see. They're also really strong at carbon sequestration. So it would be really great to have a landscape that had both trees and native grasses. That would be a carbon powerhouse is what I would call it. But yeah, trees do a tremendous job. I think they can shade an exterior and account for 20 to 40 degree reduction of temperatures for a building. So it's another really strong argument for using trees as shade in a lot of our homes. And I've never been able to figure out why when we build new houses or create new developments, that trees aren't considered more strongly. They're kind of put in as an afterthought. But really these giant homes could really benefit from having some shade from trees, and being invested in the health of those trees to make sure that they make it to a good size. But anyways, I'm sorry, I'll get off my soapbox. If you're really interested in how trees will be affected by climate and climate change, this was a really interesting publication that I found, forestadaptation.org. And they give a lot of species that we see here in Maryland, but it could apply for anywhere that these plants grow. And it gives you a chart of what are their adaptabilities to these different climatic changes. And there are some species that perform better than others. Like a good example is black gum. Black gum has a really good response to habitat change and to high climate change. And so that might be a species that you select for the long term, because of course it's going to live a long time. And understanding that our climate is making changes, it's going to be able to adapt to some of those changes as well. So this is just an example of one of the many tools out there, or many publications that are at our fingertips that we can use to help make decisions when it comes to selecting plants. And of course, I have a whole slew of resources. Again, I think I talked to Emily and Haley. We're going to send out a PDF of the slides so that you guys can have access to these different links. And these are all publications or links that I referenced during the presentation. I think they'll be very helpful, especially if you're looking at evaluating your own landscapes and trying to figure out what plants are the best choices for the right place. And with that, I think we are officially ready for questions.